The car had barely stopped moving when Alistair Farrow pushed the door open and stepped into the cold morning air of Ashkcom Hall. He did not look at the house. He did not look at the garden that used to make Alina smile. He looked only at the folder in his hand, the one with the papers that would end his marriage before noon. He had rehearsed this moment for weeks. Walk in, speak calmly, ask her to sign, leave before lunch. Simple, clean, final. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dobbs, opened the door before he could knock. Her face did not have the polite blankness he expected. It had something closer to worry. "Your Grace," she said, her voice careful, "perhaps you should have written ahead." "I did write ahead," Alistair said. 3 times she did not answer. Mrs. Dobbs opened her mouth, then closed it again. She stepped aside instead, letting him into the hall he had not entered in 8 months. The house smelled the same. Old wood, faint lavender, the particular quiet of a home that had once held 2 people and now held 1. He walked toward the drawing room where Alina always took her morning tea, papers tucked under his arm like a shield. Then she stepped into the hallway. She was wearing a soft gray robe, her hair loose around her shoulders, a cup of tea forgotten in her hand. She looked tired in a way he had never seen on her before, not the tiredness of a bad night, the tiredness of months. His eyes moved down without his permission, without his control. The robe did nothing to hide it. There was no mistaking the shape of her, the way she stood now, one hand resting where her waist used to be. Alistair stopped walking. The folder slipped an inch in his grip. "Alina," he said, and his voice did not sound like his own. She did not answer right away. She only watched him, the way a person watches whether they cannot control, waiting to see which way it would turn. "You should not have come without warning," she said finally. "You are pregnant." It was not a question. He said it the way a man says something he still does not believe, even as it stands in front of him. Alina's hand tightened slightly around her cup. "I am aware," she said, and there was an edge in it, something sharp wrapped around something soft. Alistair looked at Mrs. Dobbs, who suddenly found great interest in the floor. He looked back at Alina. "How long?" he said. "Long enough that it is not your concern." "Alina." "Alistair." She said his name the way one says a warning. "You came here for papers. There they are in your hand. Sign your side. I will sign mine. That is all that needs to happen today." He did not move toward the small writing desk by the window, the one where such things were meant to be settled. He stood in the middle of the hallway, staring at her stomach as though it might answer questions she would not. "Whose is it?" he said, quieter now. Something crossed her face, gone before he could name it. Hurt, maybe, or something colder. "That question," she said, "is exactly why I did not tell you." She turned, robe moving softly around her, and walked back toward the drawing room without waiting to see if he would follow. Mrs. Dobbs gave him a look that was almost pity before she too disappeared down the hall, leaving him alone with the folder and the silence. Alistair stood there for a long moment. He thought about the last time he had seen her, 8 months ago, the night she had overheard him on the telephone agreeing to terms his mother had arranged, terms that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with family name and family money. He remembered her face in the doorway that night. He remembered the sound of the front door closing, softer than he expected, softer than a slam, which had somehow been worse. He had told himself it was for the best. A marriage built on paper could end on paper, simple, clean. Nothing about this morning felt clean. He followed her into the drawing room. She was sitting now, one hand resting on the arm of the chair, the other still holding her tea though she had not taken a sip. The fire had not been lit. The room was cold and she did not seem to notice. "Sit down if you intend to interrogate me," she said. "Standing over me will not make the answer arrive faster." He sat, though every part of him wanted to remain standing, wanted some kind of height advantage in a conversation where he had none. "I have a right to know," he said. You gave up your rights the night you agreed to end this marriage, before it had a chance to become anything. That is not what happened. It is exactly what happened. I heard you, Alistair. I heard every word. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and she pressed her lips together as if she could physically hold the feeling back. He wanted to argue. He wanted to explain the pressure his mother had put on him, the debts tied to the estate, the arrangement that had been decided before he was old enough to understand what marriage even meant. He wanted to explain that agreeing to a future divorce on paper, for the sake of appearances, was not the same as wanting to lose her. But looking at her now, tired and guarded and carrying something he did not understand, he knew none of that would matter. Not yet. "The doctor," he said instead. "Who is your doctor? I want to know you are well cared for." "I am cared for," she said. "I do not need a duke to arrange my medical appointments." "I am not just a duke to you." "You made sure that you were," she said, and the words landed harder than anything else she had said that morning. Silence stretched between them. Outside, a bird called once, then stopped, as if even it sensed it should not interrupt. Alistair looked down at the folder still in his hands. The papers inside represented weeks of legal meetings, careful language, signatures waiting to be added. An hour ago they had felt like freedom. Now they felt like something he was being asked to do at the worst possible moment, for reasons that no longer made any sense to him. "I'm not signing these today," he said. Alina's eyes lifted to his, sharp and surprised. "Excuse me." "I said I am not signing them today." "You came all this way specifically to sign them." "I came all this way to end a marriage," he said slowly, "and I did not know when I left London this morning that ending it meant walking away from this as well." His eyes moved briefly, unwillingly, to her stomach again. Alina's hand moved protectively, without her seeming to notice she had done it. "This is not a bargaining piece, Alistair. This is not something you get to reconsider your decisions over." "I am not treating it as a bargaining piece." "Then what are you treating it as?" He did not have an answer, not one he trusted himself to say out loud, not with her looking at him like that, like she expected him to disappoint her the way he apparently already had. "I need time," he said finally. "You have had 8 months of time." "I did not know." "That is not my failure to correct," Alina said, standing now, tea finally set aside on the small table beside her chair. "You cannot arrive with divorce papers in one hand and demand answers with the other, and expect me to organize my life around whatever confusion this has created in yours." She was breathing a little harder than before, her hand pressed briefly to her side. "Are you all right?" Alistair asked, standing quickly. "I am fine," she said, though her voice had lost some of its sharpness. "The doctor says these things happen. Do not use it as another excuse to stay." "I was not going to." "You were about to." He closed his mouth, because she was right, and there was nothing satisfying in being caught so easily. She walked to the window, arms crossing loosely over herself, looking out at the gray garden as though it held answers neither of them had. "You should go back to London," she said, without turning around. "Send someone for the papers next week." "I am not leaving until I understand what is happening here." "You are not entitled to understanding, Alistair. You are entitled to a signature, nothing more." He looked at her back, at the tension in her shoulders, at the way she held herself like someone bracing against a wind only she could feel. Something in him, some old instinct he thought he had packed away with the rest of their marriage, refused to walk toward the door. "I am staying the week," he said. Alina turned then, disbelief plain on her face. "You cannot simply decide that." "I can and I have. This is my home. It is also mine, legally at least until those papers are signed." Her eyes narrowed. "You would use the very papers you refuse to sign as your reason to remain." "I would use whatever reason keeps me in this house until I know you are safe, and until I know the truth." For a moment neither of them spoke. The fire remained unlit. The tea had gone cold. Outside the bird called again, closer this time, as if drawn by the tension it could somehow sense. "You will not like what you find," Elena said quietly. "I did not come here expecting to like anything," Alistair said. "I came here expecting an ending. Instead, I found the one thing I never prepared myself to see." He set the folder down on the small table, papers unsigned, the pen he had brought still clipped inside its cover, untouched. Elena watched him do it, something unreadable moving behind her eyes. "Then I suppose," she said softly, "we are both about to be surprised by what happens next." Neither of them moved to break the silence that followed. The fire stayed cold. The papers stayed unsigned. And between them stood a question neither one was ready to answer, though both of them already suspected it would change everything that came after. The knock on the door came at 9 the next morning, sharp and impatient, the kind of knock that belonged to someone who had never once in her life waited for anything. Alistair recognized it before Mrs. Dobbs even reached the entrance. His mother had a way of announcing herself before she was seen. "Your Grace," Mrs. Dobbs called from the hall, her voice tight, "the Dowager Duchess has arrived." Elena, seated at the small breakfast table with a plate of toast she had barely touched, closed her eyes briefly, as though gathering strength for something she already knew would be unpleasant. "She was not invited," Elena said. "She rarely needs to be," Alistair replied, standing. Margaret Farrow swept into the room moments later, dressed as though she were attending a funeral rather than a family disagreement, her presence filling the space the way cold air fills an open door. "I heard," she said without greeting, "that my son came here to end his marriage and instead discovered he is to be a father." "Word travels quickly," Elena said flatly. "Word travels exactly as quickly as I make it travel," Margaret said, settling into a chair without being asked, eyes moving over Elena with an assessment that made Elena's spine straighten. "You are further along than I expected. I was not aware my condition was a matter for public accounting." "It is very much a matter for accounting when the child in question may be the heir to Ashkcom." Margaret's eyes flicked toward Alistair. "Assuming, of course, that the child is who it ought to be." The words landed in the room like a struck match. Elena's fork clattered softly against her plate. "Mother," Alistair said, a warning in his voice. "I am simply saying aloud what everyone in this house is already thinking," Margaret said, unbothered. "You left London a married man intending to return a free one. Instead you return home with rumors of an heir whose father is very much in question. Forgive me for wanting clarity." "There is no question," Elena said, voice low and hard, "not one that concerns you." "It concerns me a great deal, when the future of this family's title rests on the answer." Alistair stepped between them, though there was no physical distance to close, only the distance of words that had already done their damage. "That is enough." "It is not nearly enough," Margaret said, standing now, moving closer to Elena with the particular kind of authority that came from decades of being obeyed. "You will understand, my dear, that a duke cannot simply take the word of an estranged wife regarding matters of succession. There are tests, arrangements, ways of confirming such things before any name is placed on any certificate." Elena's hand had gone to her stomach again, that same unconscious, protective motion Alistair had noticed the day before. This time her eyes were not guarded. They were furious. "You may leave my house," Elena said quietly, each word measured and cold. "Your house," Margaret repeated, almost amused. "How quickly you forget whose name is on the deed." "Enough," Alistair said again, louder this time, stepping fully between the two women. "Mother, you will not speak to her that way in my presence or otherwise." Margaret's eyebrows rose, surprise flickering across features that rarely showed it. "You are defending her." "I am defending decency," Alistair said. something you seem to have misplaced somewhere between London and here." For a moment, Margaret said nothing, studying her son with an expression that shifted from surprise to something more calculating. "You intend to keep her, then, regardless of the answer to the obvious question?" "I intend," Alistair said carefully, "to find out the truth in my own time, and I do not require your assistance in doing so." Margaret's gaze moved once more to Elena, lingering on her for a long moment before she gathered her gloves from the table. "Very well, but understand, both of you, that the family will not simply accept an uncertain heir because it is convenient for your marriage to continue. There are papers for that as well, papers far more complicated than the ones you apparently declined to sign yesterday." She left the way she had entered, without waiting for a response, her footsteps echoing down the hall until the front door closed behind her with a finality that seemed to shake the walls. The silence she left behind was worse than her presence had been. Elena sat very still, staring at the cold toast on her plate, her jaw tight, her breathing slow and controlled in the way of someone forcing themselves not to cry. "I am sorry," Alistair said quietly. "She should not have spoken to you like that." "She spoke to me exactly the way she has always wanted to," Elena said. "You simply were not in the room enough times before to notice." The comment struck deeper than she perhaps intended, or perhaps exactly as much as she intended. "Elena." "Do not," she said, standing abruptly, one hand braced on the table for balance. "Do not comfort me. Do not defend me. Do not act as though one moment of standing up for me erases 8 months of silence. I did not know about the child during those 8 months." "You knew about me," she snapped. "You knew you had a wife somewhere, carrying whatever future you had decided not to think about. You let months pass without a single letter that was not about legal proceedings. I thought that was what you wanted." "I wanted you to fight for something," Elena said, her voice breaking slightly despite her best effort to hold it steady. "Once. Just once. Instead, I got lawyers and silence, and now, finally, when it is far too complicated to be simple, I get concern." She walked toward the door, one hand pressed briefly against her side as she had done the day before, a small wince crossing her face that she tried to hide and did not quite manage. "Elena, wait." "I am tired, Alistair," she said, not stopping. "Tired of questions I cannot answer to your satisfaction. Tired of being examined like evidence in a trial I did not agree to attend. I only want to understand." She stopped then, turning back to look at him, and there was something in her face that was not anger anymore. It was closer to exhaustion, the kind that came from carrying something alone for far too long. "You want to understand whose child this is," she said quietly. "That is what you actually want. Do not dress it up as anything softer than that." He did not deny it, because there was nothing honest to say that would soften it. "You do not get to want this now," Elena said, and the words landed with a quiet, devastating finality. "Not after everything. Not simply because seeing me changed your plans for an afternoon." She left the room before he could answer, her footsteps slow and careful on the stairs, one hand trailing along the railing in a way that made him want to follow, to catch her if she stumbled, though he forced himself to remain where he stood, unsure if his presence would help or only make things worse. He remained in the cold dining room a long while after she had gone, staring at the door his mother had swept through, then at the door Elena had disappeared behind, feeling for the first time in years entirely unequal to a situation he had once believed he understood completely. Later that evening, Mrs. Dobbs found him in the study, staring at the unsigned papers he had left there the day before. "She is resting now, Your Grace," the housekeeper said gently. "The doctor visits tomorrow if you wish to be present." "Does she know you are telling me this?" "She did not forbid it," Mrs. Dobbs said carefully, which he understood to mean she also had not permitted it. "I will be there," Alistair said quietly. Mrs. Dobbs nodded, then hesitated at the doorway. Your Grace, if I may, whatever answer you are searching for, I hope you consider what you intend to do with it once you have it. She has survived a great deal these past months without you. She does not need an answer that only serves to send you away again. She left before he could respond, leaving him alone with the papers, the fire finally lit but doing little to warm the room, and a growing certainty that whatever truth waited for him would demand far more from him than a signature ever could. The doctor arrived at 10 the next morning, a calm, brisk woman named Louise Carter, who greeted Alistair with polite surprise and Alina with the familiarity of someone who had visited many times before. You did not mention the Duke would be present, Dr. Carter said to Alina as they settled into the drawing room. He invited himself, Alina said, though there was less bite in it than there had been the day before. Dr. Carter opened her bag, laying out instruments with practiced efficiency. Well then, Your Grace, since you are here, you should know that your wife has been an excellent patient, if a stubborn one. She insists on doing far too much for a woman in her condition. I run a household, Alina said. It does not run itself simply because I am carrying a child. It could run itself a great deal more if you allowed the staff to help you rather than insisting on doing everything yourself, Dr. Carter said, not unkindly, checking Alina's pulse with quiet attention. Blood pressure again, please, Mrs. Dobbs, if you would fetch the cuff. Alistair sat rigid in his chair, watching the examination with a focus that surprised even himself. He had never once, during their brief and complicated marriage, seen her cared for medically. It struck him now how little he actually knew about this part of her life, this quiet routine of appointments and careful monitoring that had apparently been happening for months without him. Dr. Carter's expression shifted slightly as she read the numbers Mrs. Dobbs relayed to her. Not alarm exactly, but a narrowing of focus that made Alina sit up straighter. Is something wrong? Alina asked. Your pressure is elevated again, Dr. Carter said. Higher than last week. I would like you resting more than you have been. No stairs unless necessary. No stress if it can possibly be avoided. Her eyes flicked briefly, meaningfully toward Alistair. I have been under some stress, Alina admitted quietly. I imagine you have, Dr. Carter said, gathering her instruments. I will not lecture you on the causes of it. I will only say that at this stage with these numbers, stress is not simply uncomfortable. It carries real risk for you and for the child. The word risk settled over the room like a weight. What kind of risk? Alistair asked, his voice quieter than he intended. The kind that requires careful management, not panic, Dr. Carter said, addressing him directly for the first time. Elevated pressure in pregnancy can develop into something more serious if it is not controlled. Rest, calm, proper nutrition. These are not suggestions. They are requirements. I will see that she rests, Alistair said immediately. I do not need you managing my rest, Alina said, though her voice had lost its usual sharpness, worn thin by something closer to worry now that she had heard the word risk spoken aloud in her own drawing room. Then allow me to manage the parts of the house that cause you stress, Alistair said. The correspondence, the estate matters, whatever it is that keeps you climbing stairs when you should be sitting still. Alina looked at him for a long moment, clearly weighing pride against practicality, and for once practicality won, though barely. The tenant accounts, she said finally. They have been neglected since I stopped feeling well enough to review them properly. I will handle them, Alistair said. Dr. Carter watched this exchange with quiet interest before closing her bag. I will return in 4 days. Sooner, if anything changes. Please do send for me immediately if you experience headaches, vision changes, or swelling beyond what is normal. She left with a final look at Alistair, one that seemed to carry an unspoken instruction he understood without needing it explained. Do not be the cause of the very stress you have just promised to prevent. That afternoon, While Elena rested upstairs against her own protests, Alastair sat in the study attempting to make sense of tenant ledgers he had never once looked at during their marriage. He was still working through the columns of figures when Mrs. Dobbs appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral in a way that immediately put him on alert. "Your Grace, there is a visitor." "Send them away. Mrs. Farrow is resting and should not be disturbed." "He is asking for her specifically," Mrs. Dobbs said. "A Mr. Julian Hart." Alastair's pen stopped moving across the page. He knew the name. Everyone in their circle knew the name, in the quiet way people knew things they were not supposed to mention aloud. Julian Hart, Elena's first attachment, the young man her family had once hoped she might marry before the arrangement with the Farrow estate had made such a match impossible. He had heard vaguely that Julian had gone abroad years ago. He had not heard that Julian had returned. "Show him to the front room," Alastair said, standing. "I will see him myself." Julian Hart looked exactly as Alastair had imagined him, which somehow made it worse. Tall, easy in his posture, the kind of handsome that came with confidence rather than effort. He offered a polite, unbothered smile when Alastair entered. "Your Grace," Julian said, "I confess I expected to find Elena, not her husband." "She is resting, the doctor's orders." "Is she unwell?" Julian's smile faded slightly, something that looked like genuine concern crossing his face. "She is pregnant," Alastair said, watching closely for any reaction. Julian's expression did not change in any way that suggested surprise. "Yes, I had heard as much, actually, which is rather why I have come. I wish to see for myself that she was being properly looked after." "By whom precisely did you hear this?" "The village is small, Your Grace. News travels through it the way water travels through a low field. I heard weeks ago that Elena was expecting, and separately only recently, that you had returned to the estate with papers meant to end the marriage." Julian's eyes were steady, unreadable. "I confess I found the timing curious." "As did I," Alastair said flatly. "I only wish to offer my support, as an old friend, nothing more." "Elena has support," Alastair said. "She has a household, a physician, and a husband, whatever the current state of our papers." Something flickered across Julian's face there and gone too quickly to name. "Of course," he said smoothly. "I did not mean to suggest otherwise. Please, simply tell her I called. I would not wish to intrude on her rest." He left with the same easy grace he had arrived with, and Alastair stood in the front room a long while after the door closed, turning over the conversation, searching for the thing that had felt wrong about it and not quite finding the words for it. It was not what Julian had said. It was the certainty with which he had said it, the comfort of someone who believed, quietly and completely, that he still had some claim on this house and the woman inside it. That evening, Alastair mentioned the visit to Elena over a dinner she picked at without much appetite. "Julian came here," he said carefully. Elena's fork paused over her plate. "Did he?" "You do not seem surprised." "I am not," she admitted. "He wrote to me some weeks ago. I did not answer." "Why not?" "Because there was nothing to answer," Elena said, though something in her tone suggested the matter was not quite so simple as she made it sound. "Julian left years ago without so much as a proper goodbye. He does not get to reappear now and expect a warm welcome simply because circumstances have shifted. He seemed to believe he still had some place here." "Then he is mistaken," Elena said, setting her fork down entirely. "Whatever place Julian once held in my life ended long before you and I were ever arranged into this marriage." Alastair studied her carefully, searching for the truth beneath the words, uncertain whether he believed her completely or whether some old, ugly suspicion still lingered at the edge of his thoughts. "The child," he began. "Is not a subject for tonight," Elena said firmly, one hand pressed briefly to her temple. "Dr. Carter said no stress. This conversation is stress." "I am not trying to upset you." Then stop asking questions you already suspect will upset me, she said, though there was less anger in it now than simple exhaustion. I have told you the truth as much as I intend to tell it tonight. If you cannot accept that, the fault is yours, not mine. She excused herself shortly after, leaving Alistair alone at the table with a meal he no longer had any appetite for and a growing, uncomfortable awareness that his extended stay, meant to uncover the truth, had so far uncovered nothing except more reasons to doubt everyone involved, including, increasingly, himself. Over the following days, Julian found reasons to appear near the estate with a regularity that seemed designed to be noticed. Once at the village shop when Mrs. Dobbs went for supplies, asking careful questions about Alina's health. Once near the church, offering a friendly wave to Alina herself as her carriage passed, a wave she did not return but did not entirely ignore either. Alistair watched these small moments accumulate with a tension he did not entirely trust himself to manage calmly. He extended his stay again at the end of that week, citing estate business that grew flimsier by the day, though no one in the household challenged him on it, not even Alina, who seemed to have stopped expecting him to leave at all. It was Mrs. Dobbs who finally said aloud what everyone else had only implied. "You are not staying for the tenant ledgers, Your Grace," she said one evening, finding him again in the study long after the household had gone quiet. "No," Alistair admitted, "I am not." "Then perhaps it is time you decided what you are actually staying for, before Mr. Hart decides it for you." She left him with that thought, and the ledgers, neither of which offered him any comfort as the fire burned low, and the house settled into the particular silence of a home holding its breath, waiting to see which direction its story would finally turn. The nursery had not been used in years, not since Alistair himself had been small enough to sleep in it, and he only found it by accident, searching for a spare blanket Mrs. Dobbs had mentioned storing somewhere upstairs. The door was ajar, and inside the room had been quietly, carefully transformed. A small bed, fresh curtains, a shelf of neatly arranged linens, clearly prepared in secret over many weeks. Alina had been planning this alone, without a single word to him. He stepped inside, meaning only to retrieve the blanket, and instead found himself studying the careful work of a woman preparing for a child entirely by herself, with no expectation that anyone else would be present to help her. It struck him with a force he had not anticipated, a mixture of guilt and something else, something closer to tenderness, that he did not have time to fully examine before his foot caught against a loose floorboard near the window. Something small and metallic skittered across the wood and came to rest against the leg of the crib. He bent and picked it up. It was a locket, small and tarnished with age, the kind of simple piece a young woman might wear every day without thinking much of it. He turned it over in his palm, and something about it tugged at a memory he could not immediately place. He opened it. Inside was a small portrait, faded but still clear enough to recognize. Not Julian. Not himself either, not exactly, though the resemblance was unmistakable once he looked closely enough. It was his own father, painted young, decades before Alistair had been born, worn by someone who had clearly treasured the image enough to carry it close for years. He stood very still, understanding arriving slowly, piece by piece, the way understanding often does when a person is not ready for it. This had not belonged to Alina originally. It had belonged to his own mother, decades ago, before she had become the cold, calculating woman he knew now. He remembered faintly a story from childhood, something about a locket lost the night his mother left his father's side during a quarrel, never recovered, a piece of family history that had simply faded into forgotten legend over the years. Alina must have found it somewhere in this house, kept it, treasured it perhaps as a small piece of family history belonging to the child she carried, regardless of who else believed that child belonged to someone else entirely. He carried it downstairs, his mind working quickly now, connecting threads he had refused to examine closely before, Julian's visits, Alina's silence, his mother's cutting insinuations. None of it, he realized now, had anything to do with proof. It had only ever been suspicion, built on absence and old wounds, never on anything solid. He found Alina in the drawing room, seated near the window, one hand resting on the small swell of her stomach as she stared out at the garden. "I found this," he said quietly, holding out the locket. Alina's eyes widened slightly at the sight of it. "Where?" "The nursery. It must have fallen from wherever you kept it." She took it gently, turning it over in her fingers before opening it, her expression softening at the small portrait inside. "I found it in an old chest, months ago, while I was preparing the room. I did not know whose face this was, only that it seemed important enough to keep safe." "It is my father's," Alastair said. "As a young man, my mother lost this locket decades ago, the night she and my father had their worst quarrel, long before either of us existed. I never believed the story was true until now." Alina studied the small portrait a moment longer before closing the locket carefully. "I kept it because it felt like something worth protecting, even before I knew what it was." Alastair watched her, something shifting inside his chest that he did not have adequate words for. "I have been so certain," he said slowly, "that the truth I was searching for was about Julian, about whether this child was mine at all. I never once considered that perhaps I had already failed the more important truth, months ago, when I let you walk out that door without a single word to stop you." Alina looked up at him, something cautious and unguarded moving across her face at once. "Alastair." "The child is mine," he said. It was not quite a question anymore. "Yes," Alina said quietly. "It has only ever been yours. There was never anyone else, not in the way you feared. Julian is a piece of my past I closed the door on long before you and I ever married. I did not tell you sooner because I did not believe you wanted to hear it, not after everything that happened between us." "I was a fool," Alastair said. "You were," Alina agreed, though there was something softer in it now, not quite forgiveness, but the beginning of a path toward it. "But perhaps not only you. I let my own hurt keep me silent when honesty might have changed things sooner." He knelt beside her chair then, taking her hand carefully in his own. "I am staying," he said, "not because of papers or my mother or anything except this. This child, whatever chance we have left to build something honest between us." Alina's eyes filled, though she blinked quickly, unwilling to let the tears fall completely. "You cannot simply decide that changes everything after one conversation." "No," he agreed, "but it is a beginning. I would like the chance to prove the rest of it slowly if you will allow me." For a moment something like hope flickered across her face, fragile but real. Then her hand tightened suddenly around his, her breath catching sharply. "Alina." "I do not know," she said, her voice suddenly strained, one hand pressing hard against her temple. "My head. Something is wrong with my vision, everything is." She did not finish the sentence. Her body went suddenly limp, the locket slipping from her fingers and clattering to the floor as she slumped sideways in the chair. "Alina." Alastair caught her before she could fall further, panic surging through him in a way he had never experienced in his entire life. "Alina, can you hear me?" She did not answer. Her breathing was shallow, her face pale, a faint sheen of sweat across her forehead that had not been there moments before. "Mrs. Dobbs," his voice tore through the quiet house. "Mrs. Dobbs, send for Dr. Carter immediately. Now, do not wait." Mrs. Dobbs appeared in the doorway within seconds, her face going white at the sight of Alina unconscious in Alastair's arms. "Oh, dear heaven." "Send the fastest rider you have," Alastair said, already lifting Alina carefully from the chair, cradling her against his chest as though she weighed nothing at all. "Tell Dr. Carter it is urgent, tell her the pressure, tell her everything she warned us about. I am taking her to the carriage now. We cannot wait for anyone to arrive here first." Mrs. Dobbs disappeared instantly. shouting instructions to the stable hands as Alistair carried Alina through the hallway, past the drawing room, past the study where he had spent so many hours over ledgers that suddenly felt meaningless, out into the cold afternoon air. "Stay with me," he said quietly, urgently, as he settled her carefully into the waiting carriage, one arm still supporting her head. "Alina, please stay with me." Her eyes fluttered slightly, unfocused, her lips moving without forming any clear words. "We are going to the hospital in town," Alistair said to the driver, his voice sharper and more commanding than it had been in years. "As fast as the horses can safely manage, and not a moment slower." The carriage lurched forward, and Alistair held Alina close against him, the locket forgotten on the drawing-room floor, the unsigned papers forgotten entirely in the study, nothing in his mind except the woman in his arms and the desperate hope that whatever truth he had finally found had not arrived too late to matter. The hospital corridor was too bright and too quiet at the same time, the kind of quiet that pressed against the ears rather than soothing them. Alistair sat on a narrow bench outside the room where Dr. Carter and two other physicians had disappeared with Alina nearly an hour before, his hands clasped so tightly together that his knuckles had gone pale. Mrs. Dobbs arrived 20 minutes later, breathless from the journey, her coat still half-buttoned. She sat beside him without a word, offering the kind of silent company that asked for nothing and gave everything. "They have not told me anything yet," Alistair said finally, staring at the closed door as though he could will it open through sheer determination. "It has been nearly an hour." "Dr. Carter is thorough," Mrs. Dobbs said gently. "Thoroughness takes time, Your Grace. Try to hold on to that instead of the silence." He nodded, though the words did little to loosen the tightness in his chest. He thought of Alina's face in the carriage, pale and unfocused, her hand going slack in his even as he begged her to stay with him. He thought of the locket on the drawing-room floor, the truth he had only just uncovered, the apology he had only just begun to offer, all of it suddenly at risk of arriving too late to mean anything at all. The door opened. Dr. Carter stepped out, her expression giving nothing away immediately, and Alistair was on his feet before he had consciously decided to stand. "She is stable," Dr. Carter said, and the words hit him like a physical wave of relief so strong his knees nearly buckled. "Her pressure rose to a dangerous point, higher than I had hoped, and there was a real risk of a more serious complication. We have managed to bring it down with medication and rest. Both she and the child are safe for now." "For now," Alistair repeated. "She will need to remain here several days for observation, and afterward strict rest at home, precisely the kind of rest she has been resisting for weeks," Dr. Carter said, a faint, knowing edge in her tone. "I trust you will see that she follows those instructions this time, Your Grace, with rather more success than before." "I will not leave her side long enough to allow otherwise," Alistair said, and he meant every word of it. "She is asking for you," Dr. Carter added, stepping aside from the doorway. "Briefly, she is tired, so do not stay long." Alistair entered the room quietly, finding Alina propped against pillows, pale but awake, her eyes finding his the moment he crossed the threshold. Relief moved across her face at the sight of him, quickly followed by something more complicated. "You stayed," she said softly, her voice thin with exhaustion. "I was never going to be anywhere else," Alistair said, crossing the room and taking the chair beside her bed, reaching for her hand carefully, as though she might still be made of something fragile enough to break. "I was frightened," Alina admitted, something in her voice cracking slightly, the careful walls she had maintained for so many months finally showing real cracks. "Not for myself, for the child. I have been so afraid these past months of losing everything alone without anyone beside me who truly wanted to be there." "I am here now," Alistair said, "and I intend to remain here, not because of papers or my mother's expectations, or anything except the simple fact that I do not wish to be anywhere else." Alina studied his face for a long moment, searching for something, and whatever she found there seemed to satisfy at least part of the doubt she had carried for so long. You cannot simply erase 8 months of silence with one frightening afternoon. No, he agreed, but perhaps we do not need to erase it. Perhaps we only need to begin building something new alongside it slowly, the way anything worth keeping is built. A tired smile touched the corner of her mouth, faint but real. That sounds suspiciously like patience, Alistair. I did not think you possessed any. I am discovering I possess a great deal more than I once believed, he said. About patience, about what actually matters, about how foolish a man can be when he mistakes silence for safety. She squeezed his hand weakly, her eyes growing heavy despite her clear effort to stay awake a little longer. Stay, she murmured, just for tonight. We can discuss the rest of it once I am not quite so tired to argue properly. I will be here, Alistair promised, and he kept his word, remaining in the chair beside her bed long after she had fallen asleep, watching the steady rise and fall of her breathing with a gratitude so large it left no room for anything else. The following days passed slowly, marked by careful monitoring, gradual improvement, and the particular closeness that grows between two people who have nearly lost something and are only beginning to understand what they still might save. Julian did not appear again, word having reached him quickly, through the same village channels that carried all news, that the Duke had remained constantly at his wife's side throughout her recovery, leaving little room for anyone to imagine otherwise about where matters stood between them. Margaret arrived once, stiff and formal, though something in her demeanor had softened considerably since news of Alina's collapse had reached her. She stood at the foot of the hospital bed, studying Alina with an expression far less calculating than before. I understand the child is healthy, Margaret said, her voice carrying less of its usual edge. He is, Alina said carefully, having learned only that morning through careful examination that she carried a son. An heir then, Margaret said, though even she seemed to hear how hollow the word sounded now, given everything that had nearly happened. She paused, something almost like discomfort crossing her features. I spoke poorly the last time I visited your home. I allowed old worries about the family name to overshadow proper concern for your well-being. That was a failure on my part. It was not quite an apology, not in the way Alina might have wished for, but it was more than she had expected, and she accepted it with a small, tired nod. Thank you for saying so. Margaret glanced at her son, seated beside the bed with a closeness that clearly had not existed before this crisis. You seem to have found your answer then. I found several answers, Alistair said. Most of them I should have found months ago had I been paying proper attention. Margaret said nothing further on the matter, though she left with considerably less coldness than she had arrived with, and Alistair found himself, for the first time in years, allowing himself a small measure of hope that even his mother's rigid expectations might eventually soften into something closer to genuine care. Alina was permitted to return home a week later, under strict instructions to rest, instructions Alistair enforced with a thoroughness that would have amused her under different circumstances, and occasionally did amuse her even now, given how completely he had transformed from a man determined to leave into one determined never to allow her out of his sight for longer than necessary. It was nearly 2 weeks after her return home that she found the folder again, tucked where it had been left in the study, the papers inside untouched, the pen still clipped uselessly to its cover. She carried it into the drawing room where Alistair sat reviewing tenant accounts that had, remarkably, continued to hold his attention even after the crisis had passed. You never signed these, she said, setting the folder on the table between them. No, Alistair said, setting his pen down. I told you I would not. And you meant it. I have meant every word I have said to you since the day I arrived to find you standing in that hallway, he said, including the ones you did not entirely believe at the time. Alina opened the folder slowly, looking down at the careful legal language, the blank lines waiting for signatures that would never now be added. Then, without a word, she lifted the papers free of the folder and tore them cleanly in half. Alistair watched her do it, something in his chest loosening completely for what felt like the first time in months. "Not because you asked me to," Alina said, setting the torn pages down, "but because I have finally come to believe you are not planning on leaving." "I am not," Alistair said. "Not now, not ever if I have any say in the matter." She sat beside him then, closer than she had allowed herself to sit in months, one hand resting over the small, steady shape of the child growing between them, the future no longer something to fear but something they had finally, carefully, chosen to build together. Outside, the garden that had once seemed so gray and forgotten had begun, slowly, to show the first signs of spring, small green shoots pressing up through soil that had spent an entire cold season believing nothing would ever grow there again. Alistair reached for Alina's free hand, lacing his fingers through hers, and for the first time since he had arrived at Ashkcom Hall with papers meant to end everything, he found himself looking forward without hesitation to whatever came next.